Welcome to another edition of Conversations with CASA. My name is Vicki Spriggs. I'm the CEO of Texas CASA and your host. My guests today are Christian Weber, who's the Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Justice at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and Alan Detloff. Alan is the Dean of the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston. Welcome to you both, and thank you both for joining us today. Typically, we record this from our office in Austin, the offices of Texas CASA, but because of COVID and the pandemic, we are all, to the viewers, recording from our respective homes or locations. So, as always, there are things that happen in the background. If they happen, please excuse us because we have great information that our guests are going to be sharing with us today. So my first question is to you, Kristen. What are your goals for the upEND movement? And then how are these different from past efforts to reform the child welfare system?
Well, first, thank you for having us. We're very excited to talk with you about the upEND movement and the work and our goals. So upEND really, it emerged out of years of work that Alan and I have been doing separately, but also together, but also work in the child welfare field to tackle intractable racial disproportionality and disparities within the child welfare system. But in short, the upEND movement is really an emerging collaborative that is aimed at ending the over-surveillance and removal of that it's experienced by Black children, Latinx kids, and Native children, and that we want to end that's a harmful practice. That's a state-sanctioned separation of families that causes harm. But we also really want to, it's not just elimination or an abolishment of the child welfare system, but it's also a reimagining of what is care and support, meaningful care and support for kids and families in their communities. So this is sort of a quick, short, what is upEND? But our goals are really, again, to end this state-sanctioned separation, and it's about true care for kids and families, ending this incredible harm that continues to happen to children. While they experience harm, they may experience some harm, that state response is harm, but that also there are larger social ills that we treat through family separation. So families living in poverty, food insecurity, housing, lack of affordable housing, and lack of meaningful prevention services that then result in the only response being this very harsh response.
So that's a mouthful. Because the issues that you're laying out are some that people have looked at over time, right? So can you talk about some of the approaches that you're using to move this work forward? Like, what specifically are you doing? How are you tackling this issue?
So I'm going to pass that to Alan first.
Well, I think I'd start by saying, part of this work is that we really want to approach this work from an anti-racist framework. Because of the disproportionate harm that the child welfare system causes to Black children, we want to really approach this from an anti-racist framework. And a big part of that is acknowledging that means that we don't come to the table with all of the answers and all of the solutions. So really, the initial part of this work is about coalition building, to reach out to the people that have been involved in this work for many years. This concept of abolition isn't something that's new. So the upEND movement isn't something that's the first to start talking about abolition. Abolition of the system, because of the disproportionate harm it causes Black children and families, is something that's been talked about for many years by activists and organizers. So we want to start by being sure that we're listening to those activists and organizers who have been involved in this work for many years and building our ideas from theirs. But in a big picture sense, I think this work is really about, one, acknowledging how harmful the involuntary and forcible separation of children from their parents is. I think we've known that as a field for decades. There's a huge body of research that talks about how harmful foster care is to children and all of the adverse outcomes that children and youth are at risk of when they exit foster care. We've also known for decades that the system over-surveils and disproportionately removes Black children. So what we have is a system that's adding to the oppression of an already vulnerable population. Black children and youth are already at risk of a host of adverse outcomes in society because we live in a society that's inundated by racism and structural inequality. When we then put them into an intervention or a system that we know also causes disproportionate harm, we're just making it more likely that they're going to experience those adverse outcomes. So a lot of this is about looking at ways to significantly reduce the reliance on removal. We know that many children are removed that don't need to be removed, and there are alternatives that can be used. So part of this is about thinking about ways to reduce the system's reliance on removal through expansions in informal kinship care, eliminating barriers to informal kinship care, enforcing things like reasonable effort standards, making sure that every possible scenario is looked at before removal is deemed necessary, and also really looking at decision-making regarding removal to ensure that children are only being removed when there really is an imminent danger of serious harm. And if we could put some measures in place to really reduce the use of removal, then we want to start having conversations about how we could use the funds that are currently used to support the maintenance of foster care and redirect those to the families and communities that really need them. We know that just a small amount of material financial support has been shown to significantly reduce maltreatment. So a lot of this is about redirecting funds from a very costly, expensive system in foster care and using those funds to support the children and families who really need it.
Super. Thank you. I mean, that I'm done. No, I'm kidding. But that's spot on. Kristen, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Ultimately, what we wanted, we know that that abolishing the child welfare system won't happen overnight. And in fact, we want to create or reimagine care so that you can abolish the child welfare system. But right now, it really is about the road to abolition, which involves shrinking this system and keeping kids in community, but also, again, tackling these larger social ills that we blame individual families for. So we're not reunifying children because their parents don't have jobs with a livable wage and they don't have housing. That's not a reason to not have kids with their families. But we all know that this is happening. Judges tell us that they're making decisions because of this. And that's not a reason. As a society, we are failing. It is not an individual family's failure. And so we're really trying to shift this into, we're not looking at individual families and sort of blaming them or pathologizing them, but we're pathologizing our society and how do we shift our society to care for one another.
Yeah. You two were saying a mouthful, and I really appreciate the big view that you're taking, and acknowledging that instead of just what you said, instead of focusing on the family as if they are the issue, looking at the societal context in which these issues are occurring, and then shifting the societal view on the issues to begin creating a response that's appropriate, which is family supports, community supports. For those working directly with children and families, what role can they play in help building, and I like the term that you use, Kristen, the reimagined system. So what role can those working with children and families play? And that's for Alan or Kristen, either one.
Yeah, I mean, we could start. I'll start, Alan, but I think this is join us. First of all, is what we would love. I imagine many of the folks that are watching this are already engaged in doing this work as well. everybody goes into this work because they care about kids and families and making sure they're better off. But what we really want people to also do is do their own anti-racism work. That CASA folks in particular have positions of power, and you exercise power over kids and families, and really explore your own anti-racism, your own, how do you be anti-racist? So we're doing that within our organizations and also among ourselves. And so we would really want you to start to do that, but then also think about how you are contributing to either over surveilling families or how you're contributing to supporting the well-being of families and getting kids to be with their families whenever possible with the supports that are needed.
And I'd add to really think about and you look at the research and think about your own practice about how harmful foster care is to children and families. I used to work in the system. I worked here in Texas, in Tarrant County for many years as an investigator. I removed hundreds of children during my time practicing. Never once did one of those children say to me, "Thank you so much for removing me from my abusive parents." And in fact, every time I would go back to see those children, all I wanted to know is when they would get to go home. And this doesn't mean that some children aren't being abused or aren't in need of some type of intervention, but we have to acknowledge how harmful the use of removal and separation from parents are. I think people over the last few years have come to see how harmful parental separation is when we witness this happen at the border. People have seen the trauma and harm that parental separation causes. That same trauma and harm happens when children are removed from their parents by the child welfare system. So really acknowledging how harmful this intervention is. When I was in the system, no one ever talked about that. No one talked about how harmful this is, the harm that we're actually causing children and families. No one checked the decisions that I was making to be sure this was absolutely necessary and absolutely the last resort. So really think through how harmful this is in intervention. And as you're practicing, be sure that you're really doing everything possible. We know that things like reasonable efforts are very rarely enforced. They're not enforced by the agencies always, they're not enforced by the courts. It's up to us, the people working in the system, the frontline workers, the supervisors of the frontline workers, to be doing everything possible to ensure that removal is absolutely necessary and everything possible to be sure that bias isn't entering decision-making. Because we know that that's one of the reasons why Black children in particularly are disproportionately removed from their families.
Thank you.
I would also just add, we really need to do a lot of work around accountability to the families. We hold families accountable to case plans, to getting their services on time. But what about the accountability to families? Accountability for a lack of a meaningful service array, accountability for the fact the family has to miss a day's worth of work to do a supervised visit or to do get their mental health services. What does accountability look like? How can accountability change? But also, I encourage people to look back at the system for why families are not together and how the system may have failed and how the system can change. And by the system, I don't mean just child welfare. I mean everybody who's supposed to be working together to support the health and safety of kids.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, excuse me, within the CASA, Texas CASA network, we have 72 CASA programs in Texas, and we currently have what's called the Collaborative Family Engagement Initiative that's been underway for the last few years, and it's about getting children either back home as soon as possible or with kin as soon as possible, recognizing the strength that comes from family. Because as Alan said, there's not a child out there, there are very few children out there that will come up to you and say, "Oh, thank you for getting me away from my family." They may want to be away from the abuser, but they want to be with their family. And so we are promoting that. And right now we have that in 71% of the CASA programs in Texas, 51 of the 72 programs, which is we're excited about. Our goal is to have that throughout the state to begin to and change practice, right? We want people looking at families and the strength of families and looking at everything that you said, the broader societal context of what's happening here. Recognizing that people don't set out to be bad parents. Right? There are crises that occur in people's lives. They might not have had a good parenting role model. Do you punish them for that? No. What do? You build some supports to help them gain that skill set, that muscle. It's just like any other muscle. If you don't have it, you can't use that arm. But once you start working that arm, then you get this muscle, right? So we teach you skills to exercise these skill muscles, if you will. And teach families how to support each other, because sometimes families don't know that either. But I think a big crime is you pull a child away. There's already been abuse. Now you separate the child from the family, and then you say to the family, oh, in order to get your child back, you have to go to these services. Well, these services are typically in neighborhoods that don't have a whole lot of capacity. The service doesn't have capacity. So there's a waiting list. So now you back the parent out, and then put COVID on top of that. I mean, COVID just brought everything front and center for everybody who said, I don't understand what you're saying. I think COVID brought it all front and center. Mm-hmm. Having said all that, I would ask you for what you know about CASA. And then, Ellen, I want to come back to you and ask you, actually, it would be both of you, Kristen, about the center and well, we kind of talked about that, but Alan, the University of Houston really comes to the forefront a lot in terms of social justice issues. And so if you'd like to take a moment to talk about that, I think this would be a wonderful opportunity. And then I want to ask you all, just in the broader context of things, what do you think CASA volunteers can do better now to support children and families? So in either order, the way you want to address that, please do.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you pointing that out. I'd say at the Graduate College of Social Work, we've really made it a priority to amplify and highlight issues of social justice, and particularly issues of racial justice. You know, I say to my faculty, staff, and students all the time, I think racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, is the biggest challenge we face in our society. It impacts all of the systems that we work in. And so we've really tried to use our space to really amplify discussions about that, to educate our students, many of whom are going to be the future workforce in child welfare agencies and other social service agencies. So we've really tried to take that responsibility seriously. In terms of what CASA can do, gosh, there's so much. And I think a lot of it is directly related to what you talked about, in that I would ask that CASA volunteers really keep a laser focus on the issue of safety, and that your job is to try to work towards children being returned to their parents as quickly as possible. That's what your role is, with a focus on safety. What I've seen happen so many times is children who are not returned to their parents once they're in the system because of things that have nothing to do with the initial maltreatment. Child comes into care, and then things are moving towards reunification. Parent tests positive for marijuana, and the reunification is delayed. Testing positive for marijuana isn't a risk factor for maltreatment. That shouldn't impact the case moving forward. I've seen cases of reunification delayed because a parent can't demonstrate a stable income. That's not a risk for maltreatment. If there's not immediate safety concerns in the home, children should be returned to their parents. And Vicki, you probably know, there are many people who point to CASA as part of the problem that contributes to racial disproportionality. There's the view that cases are looked at or reviewed through a white middle-class parenting standard. And when what's happening in a family doesn't match with the volunteers' perceptions of what they think is good parenting, good neighborhoods, good environments, then all of that leads to delays in reunification, and sometimes not reunification at all. So I would say, really do the anti-racist work that Kristen talked about. Educate yourselves about how racism impacts families' involvement in this system, how racism impacts some of the stressors that happen within Black families' homes, and really keep your focus on safety and ensuring that children are going back to their parents as soon as possible.
Thank you. Kristen, do you want to add?
Oh, it's just beautiful what Ellen said.
I know, right? Exactly.
I mean, I want to pick up Ellen's last point about CASA as an organization really doing anti-racism work and encouraging sort of how do you organize CASA and your volunteers to do anti-racist work as an expectation. It's an education, it's a journey, it's a struggle. It's, you know, Alan and I are still doing this work. It's not like we're sort of superstar experts. We're all doing this work, but we also do this work collectively. So you can reflect with one another and sort of interrupt your thinking so that you can reflect and think, am I acting in a way that's racist or anti-racist? So we would just really encourage you to do that work on an individual level, but also at a chapter organizational level.
Super, thank you. So just as an FYI for the viewers, first, let me just say thank you again, because you all are just nailing this. And for the viewers, I need to reiterate that while the CASA network absolutely appreciates the efforts that people bring, they bring compassion and heart and a desire to make a difference into the CASA arena. That's why they volunteer. They want to change the world. But however, the important part of that is the lens through which you're looking through, and recognizing that your lens may be distorted, not out of malice, but just out of how the culture frames everything. And so the work that they're talking about, that Alan and Kristen are talking about, is paramount. And one of the things we're doing at Texas CASA is working with program staff and leaders across the state to develop a curriculum that really starts digging into these issues to give local programs the information and training to create the safe environment to have these conversations. Because wanting to do a good thing is great. Knowing how and what your possible limitations are to do this great thing, to come out with the ideal great outcome is outstanding. And we're going for outstanding in Texas because we're CASA. We're damn good, and we've got some limitations. So in order for us to be great, we need to confront and address these limitations and to address these realities. And so the work that Kristen and Alan are talking about really is spot on to where we're going and how to get where we're going the right way. It's got nothing to do with your heart. It's got everything to do with the information that's provided. And so our job is to make sure we provide you with the right kind of information to move forward constructively, because we don't want racism or biased views impacting how we do what we do. We don't want classism negatively impacting how we do what we do. We don't want any other kind of gender distortion that somebody has about what's right and what's wrong impacting how we do what we do. We don't want ableism impacting how we do what we do. Race becomes the intersectionality for all this. It is the intersection where all cars collide, and so the negative outcomes are compounded. And that's really what they're talking about as they talk about addressing this issue systemically and how CASA can go about it. So again, I really, when I read about the Justice Center and what you were doing, it was like, oh, this is exciting. How are they doing this? And so to hear you all talk about it and to see the passion that you have about it and the clarity and the intentionality of your work and your vision is just really impressive. So thank you very much for joining us. I would ask, is there anything else that you want to add before we close out this segment?
I want to make sure that people engage with us and think with us on this issue. And so we have a website, upendmovement.org, or you can engage with us on Twitter at upendmovement. And we're really open. We want to hear from everybody. This is, as I said, an emerging collaborative, and which is for everybody who's working to support kids and families.
Super. Thank you. Thank you both for joining us today. And thank you, viewers, for joining us today for this edition of Conversations with CASA. We'll see you next time.